Hi, I'm Gail Hershatter. I teach Chinese history at University of California, Santa Cruz, and I'm here to talk about my book, The Gender of Memory, Rural Women and China's Collective Past. I teach modern Chinese history to undergrads. Every time I would get to the 1950s, there was nothing good to give them to read. There was all of this great stuff about the war against Japan, and then there was all of this great stuff about the 1960s, and in between there was just a list of government campaigns. Land reform, marriage law, mutual aid teams, cooperatives, Great Leap Forward, Great Leap Famine. As a list, it's like the congressional record. It's not that interesting. And I was interested in what's the connection between the government says something up here and something happens on the ground. For me, it was more of a historical interest. I wanted material to teach, and I wanted to understand what had happened to socialism once it hit the ground, and how people who were very removed from power, because they were far from Beijing, they were in pretty remote villages in Shaanxi province, but mostly not in the suburbs of Xi'an. What was the connection between what the state said in Beijing and what they understood as having happened, and what was the connection of the state's big policy objectives about women and what actually happened to women? So I understood these people to be far from power in the sense that they were farmers, rural people, and they were women. People ask me why I did this in Shaanxi. I did it in Shaanxi because there was someone in Shaanxi who had good contacts in the countryside. It's not that Shaanxi is the only place or even the most representative place, but it's a place. There ought to be people doing this in lots of places. One of the ways that it wasn't hard was it wasn't hard to get people to talk. They were dying to talk. They were waiting for someone to ask them. They were really eager to tell their stories. And I suspect that in many cases their families and their neighbors either were sick of hearing these stories or already knew the bare outlines and didn't want to go any further with it, because it was about things that had happened almost half a century before. 1949 is a big event when we teach the history. Many of the women I talked to didn't register 1949 at all. You'd say, what happened in 1949? They'd say, well, China was liberated. What happened here? I don't remember. Nothing happened here. For them, the changes that came with land reform, the marriage law, rural collectivization were a very long process, and they happened unevenly. But often the thing that brought home to people the fact that something had changed, especially if they were kids or young women at the time, was the arrival of work teams of people from outside who were there to organize for various policy objectives. And often these people weren't big, far away, high-ranking, or even military people. Sometimes they were young women who had just recently graduated from middle school themselves, who got mobilized to go out and mobilize young women in the villages to come and participate in land reform. It had to do with reorganizing work. Women in these regions, these are very poor agricultural regions, had always done a lot of agricultural labor. Often they did it because the men had to go elsewhere to look for work, or the men ran off so they wouldn't be conscripted into the nationalist army, or the men died, and women were left doing a lot of the farming, but it was considered dangerous. It exposed them to sexual assault. It was considered shameful because it showed how poor your family was. And now they were being mobilized to do agricultural labor, but not in small, vulnerable women in the family left at home formations, but rather organized with everybody else, all of the other young women in the village. The marriage law arrived at the same time that the state was trying to promote land reform. And land reform was a very contested, complicated process. And sometimes if it looked like marriage reform was going to just make life in the villages too complicated because it engendered so much conflict among families, the state, or by which I mean the local, completely overburdened cadres, put it on the back burner. The reason it engendered so much conflict is people were afraid that their daughters-in-law, for whom they had paid good money, would walk, taking that entire investment in the bride price with them. One of the things I talk about in the book is the difference between what I call campaign time that is organized by those campaigns by which we organize time, the most familiar signposts, and domestic time. But you could also say personal time or emotional time or time organized around the family. And they're quite different, but they help to constitute each other. For instance, when we asked about the Great Leap Forward, a campaign that everybody knows about, they all understood us, but they would answer back and say, oh, the time when we ate in the dining halls, oh, the time when we panned for iron ore, oh, the time when the men were off smelting steel. And for them, the thing that stood out the most was the thing that really reorganized daily household life, which was that they ate in the dining halls. I don't want to make it sound as though this is just the state puts loose all of these policy prescriptions and they're all wonderful and the only thing that happens is there's a lag time. Sometimes the collision of campaign time and domestic time highlights exactly what went wrong, not what went right. But you can't assume that these two things are going along in tandem. You always have to ask, what's the state up to? How does that get translated on the local level? And then what do people remember because it remains important to them as they remember 4 decades later? I would put it this way. A lot of the success of the collective years, a lot of the state's strategy of what some people have called primitive socialist accumulation, of laying the basis for a certain kind of industrialization and the kind of rapid economic development that took place in the reform era. A lot of that was underwritten by resources sucked out of the countryside, by state policies. And a lot of that increase in productivity and freeing up men to do other kinds of work by bringing women into basic agriculture, a lot of that labor was done by precisely this generation of women. You could say they underwrote the reforms, farmers in general and women in particular. So I think what surprised me is just how complicated these different temporalities are, that you can't just teach the temporality of state events. You can, but you're going to miss most of what is interesting there. And I think to get at most of what is interesting, you got to go talk to people. And my most fervent hope right now, because it's really too late to talk to the group that I talk to, is that people will get out there and talk to their grandparents about the 60s, 70s, 80s, and get some of this firsthand experience and reflection recorded. And later, when people have questions that have not yet arisen, historically or politically, they will have that material to go back to, because it doesn't hang around until we realize it's important. It passes from the scene.